Hi, guys, and welcome to our final lesson on the Enlightenment, or I should say, our final lesson on this PowerPoint. Um, so, we are going to do a little bit of a recap on Dennis Diderot. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you what we're going to be doing for this lesson. So, as you know, you should be filling out the Enlightenment Thinkers chart that we have. So, as you watch this presentation and the other presentations, you need to be looking for the different thinkers and talking about their ideas on government, on human nature, on economics, and or the books that they wrote. So make sure that you are doing that as we go through, because I want to make sure that you can distinguish. That's what the goal is by the end of this lesson, is that you should be able to distinguish between these different thinkers and their beliefs and their influence on democracy and the world of today, right? So, to recap a little bit on Dennis Diderot, remember we talked about he made his money from his book, The Encyclopedia, right? He edited the first encyclopedia. And his view on human nature is his purpose was to change the general way of thinking of humans, right? So his idea was that it's the idea that people are not stuck in this life, but could take charge and improve their existence by changing the general way of thinking of humans. And he sought to do this through acquisition of knowledge using the encyclopedia, which incorporated a wide variety of knowledge into one book. As you know, Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia. So whenever you hear the word encyclopedia, think of Wikipedia. That's basically what he did, but it was a book, right? And in terms of government, Dennis Diderot, he denounced slavery. He praised freedom of expression, right? That's what he fought for, was freedom of expression. And he urged for people to be educated. He wanted education for all people. And so, as you can tell, because of his emphasis on the encyclopedia and the creation of the encyclopedia, one of his biggest desires is to educate as many people as possible, and he thought the government should make sure that that happens, right? So the next person that we're going to talk about is Mary Wollstonecraft, and she is known for writing a book based on women's rights, and this book was titled "A Vindication on the Rights of Women," right? And so remember that that's the book that she wrote. And she accepted that a woman's first duty was to be a good mother, but she felt that a woman should decide her own interest, right, without depending on her husband. And in her ideal society, it was that everyone owns land and can live peacefully together. And she was against monarchy. So she wasn't like Voltaire, right? Voltaire wanted a monarchy. She was against the monarchy. She was against aristocracy, the idea that wealthy people, nobles, should have a lot of power and own land, all the land. She was against that. She fought for equal education for boys and girls, and she felt that women were being excluded from the social contract that was being talked about by other philosophers, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? And John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. When they would talk about the social contract, she felt like that discussion was excluding women. It wasn't including women's voices or women's rights or liberties, right? So she wrote a lot about women's suffrage. And she called for basically the women to have a right to vote. And she said, one of her quotes is, I really think that women ought to have representatives instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any direct share allowed them in the deliberations of government. And she also believed that education could be a way to save women, to improve the status of women. So she said that education was. She insisted that education was important. She insisted that women should be taught serious subjects like reading and writing and arithmetic, natural history, and philosophy. And she also, she rushed into print another book called "A Vindication of the Rights of Men," and this book basically was, it was very impactful, and she denounced the injustices of the British Constitution, and she singled out aristocratic practice of, passing family wealth to the eldest son and having land and all this wealth passed hereditarily, and all this power given to the few, the aristocracy. She denounced that, and so she's a very, very influential woman from this period. And she criticized the arbitrary government power, right? And she you need to remember, the most important thing is she was one of the first feminists, right, who's fighting for women to improve their position in society. And she said, again, the most important way to do that was through education. Now, the Enlightenment was centered in Europe, as we know, but Americans also participated in the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment emphasized rational thinking, the capacity to reason, and not just think with emotions. So, from the perspective of the Enlightenment, emotions do not lead to the discovery of knowledge. And so, this wasn't just a European idea. This extended to American colonists who also shared this perspective. And one of them was Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin is famous. He was on the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, along with Thomas Jefferson. He directly helped Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence. He also helped the American colonies, to secure an alliance with France during the Revolutionary War, which was instrumental in helping the American colonies to defeat the British and to become an independent nation. So Benjamin Franklin was a politician, he was an inventor, a philosopher, and he's really credited with actually inventing the lightning rod to protect buildings from being struck by lightning. That's one of his most famous inventions. And he was a man of science. He invented the bifocals, glasses, right, to be able to see and read. And he gained fame throughout Europe and in America as a printer, a publisher, a scientist. And Benjamin Franklin was also a deist, which I described in our previous lessons, right? And he became a symbol of the Enlightenment through his experiments. They became very famous. And he was known for his practical, rational advice. One of them is, he says, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's one of his most famous sayings. And he's one of the most influential American figures in the Enlightenment. Now, I mentioned Thomas Jefferson, and he's the next one. So he was a politician and a philosopher as well, and he's best known for writing the Declaration of Independence. He was the third president of the United States, and he was an inventor. For example, when it came to agriculture, he had made a few inventions, and he agreed with Benjamin Franklin when he substituted pursuit of happiness for property in Locke's natural rights philosophy. Remember, Locke believed that the three natural rights are life, liberty, and property. And Benjamin Franklin suggested to substitute it for pursuit of happiness instead of using property. And Thomas Jefferson agreed to that and included that in our Declaration of Independence, so that liberty to pursue the wildest possible human ends and dreams would be accommodated in this new country, right? So you had a right to pursue your dreams, basically. Now, Jefferson, he also exercised a lot of influence over the creation of the U.S. Constitution through his extended correspondence with James Madison during the Constitutional Convention, which we're going to talk about in a second. And he wrote, "All men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence. And what he meant by that was this idea, this Enlightenment idea, that laws apply to everyone, including nobles and the wealthy, no matter their wealth and their family, who their family was, how they were maybe related to royalty. He said that didn't matter. No group should be privileged over the others in terms of the law. And he really emphasized, like I said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He took those ideas directly from John Locke. John Locke was one of the most influential philosophers on Thomas Jefferson. And the next American we're talking about is James Madison. And James Madison is called the father of the US Constitution. And he was one of the most influential architects, writers of the Constitution. He was a politician, he was a scientist, he was president of the United States after Thomas Jefferson. He is also known for the creation of the Bill of Rights and helping to pass the Constitution, ensure that the Constitution satisfied people who wanted states to have more rights. So he was an advocate for the ratification of the Constitution, right? So they had written this Constitution, this new US Constitution, and it needed to be passed by the states. The states needed to agree to it. And Madison was instrumental in getting the Constitution ratified by the states. And he helped to write something called the Federalist Papers, which you will learn more about in 11th grade. And one of his most enduring and lasting ideas was, the argument for having the separation of powers and checks and balances contained in the Constitution. And so he took the idea of one of the most famous Enlightenment thinkers that we've already learned about. He took the idea that Baron de Montesquieu had come up with, a government with divided powers and functions among three branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial, right? Remember, that was what Baron de Montesquieu had emphasized and talked about, and he argued for. Well, that's something that James Madison used and incorporated into our Constitution, right? And he also talked about the way that he argued for that a diverse republic, and that we needed to make sure that not one group, the majority, the largest group of people, could become tyrannical and dominate minorities within the country. He was afraid of that. And so that's also something to kind of highlight that other Enlightenment idea of toleration, right? And liberty. And that even if you might be maybe not part of the majority faction, maybe you're part of a minority faction or group, that you still have rights. And the majority group, just because they're the majority, just because they have the most people, the largest numbers, that doesn't mean that they get to take away your liberty or your rights. So he wanted to make sure that the Constitution protected against that, right? And didn't allow for the majority to infringe on the rights of the minority. And the next Enlightenment thinker that we're talking about is Simon Bolivar. Right? And he was one of the South America's greatest generals and political leaders. His victories over the Spanish Empire led to the independence of Bolivia, of Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. And Bolivar, he was born in Caracas, Venezuela in 1783. And both of his parents died before his 10th birthday. But he received a good education, and he was homeschooled by several well-known tutors who gave him ideas on liberty and free thinking, some of these Enlightenment ideas that we've been talking about, right? And so he was raised by his nanny named Hipólita and his tutor Simón Rodriguez. And Simón Bolivar, he then entered the military academy in Venezuela, and he learned different military and technical strategies that he would later use in his fight for independence. So then he visited Europe, and when he returned to Venezuela in 1807, he was given a military command in New Granada, which is in modern-day Colombia. And he was given this military command to fight against the ruling Spanish Empire of the time. And Bolivar, he went on to fight many battles in New Granada. And under his command, new independence was consolidated. It was won in 1819. And so from this victory, he went on to lead successful independence campaigns in Venezuela and Ecuador as well. And then he was made president of the newly formed state of Gran Colombia, which consisted of modern day Venezuela, as well as Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, as well as parts of Brazil and Peru. And so he went on to fully liberate Peru and was then made dictator of the country. And he struggled to maintain control of this new state of Gran Colombia. So he really struggled to do that, and he appointed himself dictator as a temporary measure in order to try and save the republic. But he resigned in 1830 after failing to reestablish his authority, and he actually died at the age of 47 later that year. And Simón Bolivar, he is known as the George Washington of South America, and he's considered to be one of the most important and influential politicians in Latin American history. And actually, the country of Bolivia today in South America is named in honor of him, in honor of his legacy. So he's a pretty important figure, so make sure that you know who he is and you're able to identify him. And the last figure we're really going to talk about is Adam Smith. So Adam Smith is known as the father of modern economics, and he is most famous for writing an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, how nations became wealthy. So he wrote about that, and this book is called simply Wealth of Nations. And so what he does in the Wealth of Nations in his book is he's questioning conventional wisdom. Adam Smith was questioning the conventional wisdom of mercantilism. And mercantilism was the predominant economic system at the time during this period. And this idea of mercantilism said you need to limit the number of imports, which is the number of goods that your country buys from other countries. So, for example, let's say we're the United States and we buy imports of oil from a country like Canada, right? Canada has a lot of oil. So oil is a good, and we sometimes import goods like oil from other countries. That's what an import is. And in this mercantilist system, the idea was that you need to limit that. You don't want too many imports, right? And that you want to maximize your exports, which are the goods that you sell to other countries. So what is something the United States makes? Let's just pretend we make, Apple makes iPhones, and we can export those goods. We sell iPhones to other countries, right? So you want to try to maximize those exports and make sure you're selling as many goods as you can to other countries, because that means you're making money, right? So mercantilism also was the idea that you needed to protect your gold and silver, right? And to increase the amount of gold and silver that your nation possesses. And like that would happen, like I said, through increasing exports and decreasing imports. And so mercantilism also is the idea that you need to regulate trade. Basically, the idea is that the government in mercantilism, the government needs to be like the coach of a team. And economics is like a rivalry, right? And so Adam Smith is talking about this, he's discussing this, and he's thinking, I don't agree with this idea, not so much. And he's exploring some things, and he's using the Enlightenment again in order to do this. And remember, today we think selfishness is bad, today, right? But from the Enlightenment perspective, selfishness is neither good nor bad. Instead, selfishness is natural. It just is. It just exists. And as Voltaire said, self-love is the instrument of our preservation. So basically, he's saying it's necessary, selfishness. It's dear to us. It gives us pleasure. And we must conceal it, right? We can't let anybody know we're full of ourselves. But at the end of the day, we are full of ourselves. It's true. It's natural. Just look at anyone's social media profile. Look at Instagram, right? Human beings are self-interested. So the Enlightenment is about accepting this as natural. And we need to think about this rationally. And this is called enlightened self-interest, rational self-interest. And this is what turns uh, into the idea of the invisible hand. So according to Adam Smith, there's an invisible hand of self-interest, and it is regulating the economy. And his idea is that people don't have to be told what is good for them. For example, if I go to the butcher and I'm going to look at meat that's available there to purchase, you don't really have to tell me to buy this red steak versus this green steak that has flies all over it, right? You don't have to tell the butcher to mark down the price on that green steak. We know people would rather buy the fresher stuff, the fresher meat. And when it comes down to it, the butcher is a businessman or a businesswoman. And so the butcher needs to provide a service, a good service. And if he won't, then he won't stay open very long. Because if I go to the butcher and I get sick, then I'm not going back to that butcher, right? And so Adam Smith wrote that it is not from the benevolence from the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. So here's the thing. This is what he's saying. Okay, people are selfish. We're going to take advantage of human selfishness, and we're going to put it to use for a higher purpose. And we're going to create a mutually beneficial exchange. So something that benefits us both. So Adam Smith is looking at human history, and he's seeing that people act selfishly. And the trick is to show them that they are best off acting selfishly when other people also benefit from their selfishness. And so, therefore, everybody's happy, because when it comes down to it, self-love, as Voltaire said, it's special to us. And if we can all do what we want and what makes us happy and what we are good at, and we can all prosper as a result of it, then it's not a zero-sum game anymore. The economy can grow, and we don't even have to tell people to not be selfish in order for that to happen. We don't need a government, according to Adam Smith, to tell people what to do. If people have all the information and they're not willfully cheating, then nature is all that we need. And that is exactly in line with this whole Enlightenment idea of natural law that we've been talking about. So he really helped to build the foundation of free market economics, which is also called capitalism, right? To not have the government come in and tell businesses what to do, but to allow businesses to operate freely and to let this invisible hand regulate the marketplace, let human nature and human selfishness to regulate it. And that is what free market economics and capitalism is. So let's talk a little bit about, we're going to recap and summarize some of the biggest effects of this Age of Enlightenment, right? So the Age of Enlightenment, as I talked about Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, it helped to lead to the creation of nations. It helps to lead to greater rights for the common people. We talked about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, right? And it helped to influence the American Revolution and the revolutionaries of the French Revolution, which goes back to the concept, the idea that the Age of Enlightenment helped to affect and create new nations, right? These ideas led to the creation of new nations. It helped to inspire the writers of the Declaration of Independence. It helped to inspire the ideas that are written and included. The idea of life, liberty, and property comes directly from John Locke, the Enlightenment thinker, and Thomas Jefferson directly adopted that from him and included that in the Declaration of Independence. And the Articles of Confederation, including, and the Constitution, these two documents, right, that help to construct our form of government, having the different branches of government, as Baron de Montesquieu wrote about the separation of powers and the checks and balances that we discussed. Those are included and incorporated directly into our Constitution. And the Bill of Rights, to ensure that the majority faction cannot infringe on our rights and take our rights away. We have rights that are protected by the Constitution. So even if the majority has the most votes, they cannot take our rights away, our rights to freedom of speech, freedom of religion. This all comes back to these ideas, these Enlightenment ideas that we've discussed. So that kind of just summarizes everything that we've learned throughout this presentation, right? So let's wrap this up. The Enlightenment went from these ideas that were discussed by Montesquieu and Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. And it was turned from just ideas into reality by people like Madison, by Simon Bolivar, by Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, right? And this took more than 150 years to birth modern democracy and government, from the time of the 1600s, from when some of these ideas were being written about by Hobbes and Locke. It took about 150 years before some of these ideas were implemented, and the creation of new governments, the American government, the French government, which we will go more in depth about and study more in depth. It took over a century and a half in order for that to happen. So let me know if you have any questions. I hope you really learned something from this presentation. Let me know if you do have any questions. Email me or reach out during class, and I'll try to help you as best I can. So good luck.